Okay, so for this video, I wanted to talk about generative AI as it applies to cybersecurity. It's likely you've heard of Copilot for security. It's essentially Microsoft's foot in the door as it relates to adding some of the intelligence from large language models into your data, telemetry from various sources. So I'm putting together just kind of a high level overview of things to be aware of. I drew up a mock specific architecture I'm going to talk through, but some of the considerations in a flowchart that makes it fairly simple. So we're going to move around a little bit. I have a Copilot for security instance up. If you are going to follow along with this, this does cost money per hour, so feel free to delete after you do some testing, unless you want to keep it around and then see what are some of the capabilities. So first, I'll start off with some of the requirements as I expand this out. So essentially, you are going to have a Azure subscription. You essentially need a pay-as-you-go or enterprise agreement in Azure. And I want to say it's $3 to $4. I'll have to validate that per hour for what we call a secure compute unit. So essentially, those are the compute units that are queried when you use this service. So it's going to scale up based on the demand of that specific capacity. Obviously, understanding that this is using quite a lot of compute power. It will be recommended, at least Microsoft's official documentation says 3 secure compute units as a starting point, and then you can obviously tailor down, let's say within a couple hours when you start figuring out your actual uses. I think it's better to start smaller, start with 1 and then kind of build from there. So that's high level, the base requirements, okay? Now, there's been some updates over the past couple months, specifically when we think about August, and I'll zoom in a little bit. So this looks a little bit larger on your screen. So for August, they've added the Copilot integration with device query. I was in public preview. So essentially, if you have any devices being managed through Intune, which is the mobile device management suite, if you will, with some mobile access management, you can query using natural language that can essentially help craft KQL queries on your devices from that perspective. Around July, there was some more I didn't list before this, but typically the streaming response. So this will tell you if the experience is standalone or embedded, and we'll get into what standalone and embedded is. But essentially, this will allow real-time context back to you as it's generating the response, as opposed to essentially a delay. When you type in something, it's thinking about it, and then it goes through some type of processing at the end. This will stream the response in real time back to you. So it will appear that it's a lot faster than what's really going on. That's streaming mode. And then you'll see that Defender for threat intelligence as well. It does add the experience of embedding. So really the difference, we'll get into this in a little bit, but just at a high level, when we're talking about embedding or standalone, think about if you open up a ChatGPT session, that session is essentially a new session personal to you, right? Now, when you do embedded, this is essentially the blade that will pop up on the right-hand side of the screen. Let's say I'm in Defender for Cloud or my Entra ID specific users, and I use Copilot to query specific related detail to the screen that I am using the service. It's essentially to help assist you. That's really the embedded difference there. So that's an experience that's now capable. So let me minimize that. So I broke down the experiences similar to that. So there's 2 that you'll hear, and just to understand the terms, there's standalone, essentially the private session, just to you, a session, if you will, and we'll show what that looks like. And then embedded is essentially inside the portal, you'll see a little Copilot button, and that essentially will populate a blade. So if I'm in a security product, Azure Firewall, Azure WAF, and I say, what is this specific service identity or any identities related to the service or any pertinent info to that specific portal itself, that's where that embedded experience kind of helps you from an analyst and operations perspective, okay? The next portion too, I know at the top of mind for a lot of people, is really the regulatory concerns using generative AI in your organization. So fairly recently, the US and Canada healthcare customers, so essentially anyone that is under HIPAA regulation, this is now covered under the business associate agreement, essentially, and subject to those regulations as well. So now that is covered. Currently for US government GCC, and again, this is being recorded in mid-August, from that perspective, is not covered at this point in time. Some of the other frameworks that you're looking at that are covered under scope, if you will, ISO 2700, 2718, etc. from that perspective, okay? So top of mind typically is integrations. Now, what I'll say about Copilot for security, I try to keep it very security agnostic, but I'm also aware that obviously there is thoughts of, hey, what if we have other third-party tools and how do we kind of integrate to get the most out of this if this is kind of your first entrance into generative AI, but applying it to the security domain. And we're going to cover some of that. At a high level, I'm going to show some of the integrations in the visuals. So if you see me skip over here, that's why, okay? So from extensibilities, there's a couple paths that you can go down. There's already a whole ecosystem of ISV vendors that have put together their own plugins to really help you expedite some of the use cases that are beyond the Microsoft stack. If you're using some of those third-party vendors such as Jamf for Mac iOS, Gray Noise, Darktrace, a couple lists that you're seeing here, Shodan, that's more universal in that perspective, Valence Security, and a few others. And these are all out of the box. I'll show you what these consist of. So plugins in general, I know that's a really hot topic. How do I extend these capabilities to my third-party tools, right? So typically they can be consumed by a YAML file or JSON plugin manifest file. And I will actually show you what those look like for some of these plugins as well. But they're fairly straightforward if you're going to go the build your own route from that perspective. Additionally, the Logic apps right now are in preview as part of a connector. So you essentially can have your own Logic apps. That's that low code, no code type of visual designer to kick off a workflow that integrates with Copilot for security. So if that's something you want to expand on, that would be some areas to look at, okay? So now for the bigger elephant in the room, authentication. It's important to really note that this service really acts as the on behalf of authentication. So what that means in a nutshell is the user that is leveraging or prompting the service itself, depending on the permissions that that user has, is really the scope of what that user can do or use the service for. And we're going to get into some things to consider from a least privilege perspective and the difference between Copilot for security roles, because they're not intra predefined roles that you're commonly used to. And they're managed within Copilot, only grant access to Copilot for security features, okay? So at a high level, you have your Copilot owner. Essentially think of this highly privileged from that perspective. And I have a breakdown, let me zoom out a little bit, that I snagged from the documentation that kind of breaks this down. So if you look here, let me go back. You should see the difference here. So you can see the owner can do just about everything, okay, related to services. The contributor itself can create new sessions. So that's essentially the session we're going to go over. Private to you, essentially, hey, what are the latest threats in my environment, etc. Whatever you want to query, that's essentially a session. And then manage personal custom plugins. By default, this is not available for the contributor. And you can see here, allow contributors to manage personal custom plugins. So if you want to limit that capability to your contributors, it's already by default disabled for them, okay? So the biggest difference that you'll see here, upload files, run prompt books. Prompt books are essentially guided responses based on numerous scenarios, and we'll go over what those look like. But you want to think about the perspective, it's essentially playbooks for various skills and use of the tool to get the most out of it on specific scenarios, right? And you can obviously bring your own prompt books and your own knowledge base. That's the whole purpose of the uploaded files. And you can see down here from the capacity management, now this is where the cost is, right? So for FinOps and any billing administrators, the contributor will not be able to allocate more compute units based on usage, okay? Data evaluation, they won't be able to see the usage dashboard as well, but you can see they can change languages as well. So if they need a different language to support their use, okay? So hopefully that gives you a high level what's those differences there. Now, it's important to note too that because you're a Copilot contributor, right? Let's say you're using Microsoft Sentinel, you're using some endpoint security manager, things like that. When you're leveraging those skills, and skills are essentially related to that specific service that are calling the AI API essentially with various defined parameters, you're going to need the underlying permissions to those services. So if you have this in type of a RACI chart, it's just important to understand that, because it's likely if you're using Microsoft Sentinel, for instance, but you want to follow least privilege, you can use Microsoft Sentinel Reader if the incident response team is just pulling telemetry data from there, okay? And the reason I go into this is because I think, I want to keep it as simple and straightforward for you, but B, I don't want any gotchas if you do deploy this and follow along. Okay, so on this right-hand side here, let me move this a little bit. You'll see the traditional IAM roles, right? Security admin is highly privileged, but global admin is essentially your super admin. So if you are going to run security admin, you want to ensure that those are A, being monitored from an access review perspective, B, have high authentication authorization techniques applied to them, ideally FIDO2 keys, UB keys, things of that nature, or passwordless in some shape or form, right? But broadly, you want to see here, assigning this role purely for Copilot for access isn't recommended, okay? So it's really a best practice to create a security group, add that group to an appropriate Copilot role, right? Whether that's a contributor or owner, ideally contributor, least privilege from that perspective, okay? And let me shorten this up here. So when this service came out, right, a typical response you'll hear from many people is, okay, well, what are some of the best practices to kind of leverage this for our enterprise, right? Maybe we're considering this, but broadly, it could be with Microsoft, it could be with Beyond. So there's essentially a 5-step guide to deploying Copilot for security with following some of the zero trust principles. Now, again, I try to keep this very agnostic because it might look really different for your environment if you're not necessarily a traditional Microsoft shop. But you want to think about them in 5 specific layers, and I kind of break these down to really help out here. But at the highest level, we want to protect our admin and our security operations staff user accounts with IAM policies, right? Step 1. Now, that's going to include, when we think about the control plane itself, right? The control plane being your Azure portal from that perspective, but also that access point to Copilot for security, right? Because it's behind that access authorization piece. So what this really falls into are 3 specific areas, right? Ideally, you should be using MFA for all sign-ins. That's going to be forced around October for all accounts, even break glass accounts. Hopefully that's not the first time you're hearing this, but you should be getting notifications from Microsoft about that. You should look at blocking clients that don't support modern authentication, and then compliant PCs and modern devices from that perspective. So if you're using mobile, iPads, things of that nature, this is essentially enforcing those conditional compliance checks on those end devices. Now, the only differentiator that I always point out to if it's a license type thing, high-risk users, essentially from when we're looking at user risk, sign-in risk, if those users do meet those criterias, and they're essentially put in a high risk category from that perspective, right? That policy enforcement engine that is conditional access, you want to require some password change for that to minimize that, okay? And then adherence to Intune device compliance policies. So this might look different, right? Maybe use a Jamf, maybe use VMware Workspace ONE, but ideally you want to segment and ensure that you review your policies that are existing that are going to have the roles ideally specific to Copilot for security in that first place, okay? Next, you want to create a separate set of policies for your privileged users. Ideally, your privileged users should have a very stringent amount of policies applied to them because of the level of access that they're accessing through most organizations in some shape or form, right? This is why I talk about FIDO2 keys, UB keys, ideally. Some organizations will use additional risk identity indicators as well. This is known as like Okta ASAs or Cisco Duo. I think they call it adaptive access. It's looking for more specific validity or integrity to the API calls that you are saying who you say you are, and you go through various checks, right? What is the time of day that the user's logging in? Things of that nature, okay? And then when we look at inclusion of security tools in the scope of conditional access, so this is a big one, okay? So when I talk about access on behalf of, so let's say I'm a traditional security administrator inside Azure specifically, right? But maybe I'm going to integrate Defender for XDR or Microsoft Intune, things of that nature. If I don't have the underlying access to these little sub-services that are essentially being queried from the system itself, it really relies on that on behalf of authentication. So this won't, in the sense, do auto GPT or auto actions without your said consent or without that human in the loop, okay? So this is a big one. And the reason I call a RACI chart out here is because this can get, especially for a large enterprise, we're talking like 50,000 people and beyond, this would likely be a headache without some form of a RACI chart, ideally for your SecOps staff users and your admin users, okay? Given the amount of attacks I see on the control plane, you really want to look at that. Then second, we'll move into the apply the least privilege access to admin and SecOps. So this is those staff user accounts as well, right? So then we're looking at, okay, first we have to ensure that we're enforcing from the device layer specific policies related to those users. And then now we're going to say, okay, what do they have actual access to, right? So ideally we want this as minimal as possible for the right use at the right time, right? So you'll see here, this kind of has it outlined, adoption of privilege access management for Copilot for security. So that might look a little different for every organization if you have some type of privilege access management, i.e. some type of vault, CyberArk, things of that nature. And this is really that in just-in-time type of access. You elevate just when needed, you de-escalate or you de-elevate from that level of access when you don't need that access. Ideally, this limits the blast radius. Now, I know it's not practical for every organization, but it's a call out there as well, okay? Now you'll see here the privilege identity management together for Copilot for security, but it's important to note this is typically behind Azure AD P2 or Entra ID P2 now. So if you are not necessarily an E5 shop, it's something to consider if you have that use, but it's not always the end all be all, right? Maybe you have some other type of API flows that are performing something similar, or maybe you have a third party that helps out with that, okay? The next one here, the configure or reviewing least privilege access for your admin and SecOps user. So this is really goes along the principles of how are you really managing long-term established credentials, if you will. Ideally, there should be some type of cadence. There is a specific link of least privilege roles by task, and that's really a good start. And then you'll see here a lot of references to some form of privilege identity management for that area, or you can use Purview privilege access management to configure those controls. But notice those are limited to admin task in O365, right? So if you're using other workspaces or other productivity suites, it might not meet that use case. So you want to think agnostically, but also addressing every layer of the stack, okay? So the last three that you'll see here, manage and protect your actual admin and security operations staff devices. So the secure devices for privileged access, so ideally this will talk about that compliance policy from earlier, but this would be that enforcement, right? So maybe you have a privileged access device that's a hardened workstation. We call this privileged access workstations. These are separate devices from your day-to-day devices that you're using. Important to understand that deviation, okay? I know there's a lot of people who argue, well, what if I have a virtual machine or virtual box, things like that? This is a fully hardened, isolated workstation from that perspective. How you achieve that, that's your own prerogative, but just to let you know, in principle, it should be its own separate device from that. So if you're elevating for specific criterias and things of that nature, this is one of those ways to achieve that. Okay, not the only way, before I see any comments saying otherwise, okay? Now you'll see here, the last one, or step 4, out of this is deploy or validate your threat protection. So broadly, threat protection is going to be essentially the foundations of, okay, the resources that we do have, are those threat mapped out, threat modeled to the organization? That includes those software as a service applications. So ideally, you're managing that through some type of either CASB, web proxy, secure web gateway of some sorts, right? And then when we think about the cloud resources, since there's servers, serverless, API security, ideally that would be some type of workload protection. These are known as cloud native application protection platforms, but you also want to think about your API security, and then your endpoint security, traditional XDR, EDR from that perspective. Ideally, you have some source of truth that goes into some type of log aggregation, a SIEM for your operations center, okay? And then this last step, step 5, is going to be the access to those third-party security products, right? So everyone's security stack might look different from just a vanilla everything Microsoft out of the box, right? So in that perspective, there's guidance that talks about if you are using security products that are using a plugin per se, that those are also tied to some form of a conditional access policy for just strict enforcement on the use of that to help out your security operations staff as well. And ideally, you should have those kind of mapped as well, reviewed, whether that's quarterly, however much time you have from your organization, okay? So taking a step back, right, this is quite a lot to get to the end. Now, again, how you adopt this or how you already have some of these foundational aspects in place, right, it likely is a easier lift, if you will, okay? So when we talk back here, and I'll zoom in a little bit, and I'll move into my specific pencil here. Okay, so you'll see here, when we're talking about MFA for our sign-in risk medium or high, right, how this is achieved could be another IDP as well. It's things to remember, but this is essentially your starting point, right? And then you have your enterprise when we're looking at production, and then you have your specialized security, right? So you want to think about this these are levels of an enclave for the posture of how you should apply certain protections, if you will. Right, so you'll see here only if needed for specific data sets or specific users or users from that perspective. And this is going to be much more strict in nature, right? So this might have a level 3 app data protection, where above in enterprise we're at level 2. And then if you can see, even at our starting point, we're starting to introduce level 2 app protection policies and data protection, one for each platform from that perspective. Okay. And as you can see, this is just to give you general good guidance. Now, conditional access, you want to just think about a policy enforcement engine, if you will, that you define certain policies for. Ideally, you want this very confined. You want this rigorously tested as well. But this will also call out here in this visual where there's a licensing requirement, right? Now, I always will point out specific areas to let you know, but also what's kind of the thought process around that too, to be fully transparent. It's not just, oh, I can turn this on right now, right? These things take time, okay? So hopefully this visual at least gives you some of the guidance broadly when we're thinking about identity and device access policies, right? And notice up here, we have the difference between compliance and then app protections, right? So is the device compliant? Yes, okay, but what are the protections in place for those applications that we're using, right? So 2 different concepts, but things to remind yourself about. So now, when we get into the deeper visual, this is going to show here. Let me back up a little bit. Okay. Let me move over right here. Okay. And just so I zoomed in enough, this is just to give you a high-level visual, and I'm going to mark up this a little bit. So you'll see that at the core is where this specific subsystem is queried. We have number 1 here is user prompt. I know this looks a little janky. These are essentially the encryption mechanism. This is supposed to be a lock, but the closest icon I had in the library was a key. These are essentially the flows for the data flow of the user's interaction. So first we start up on the top, and let me zoom up a little. We have our prompting area, right? So this is the Copilot for security. These are the experiences, right? So you have embedded and standalone. As of today, the embedded ones are listed here of what is supported in the portal right now. And then the standalone is essentially just your own private session like we talked about. So you have the user prompt, right? The user prompt will go to the service itself. And then that goes to step 2. This will look for specific plugins related to that prompt. So maybe I ask something about what is my external attack surface management for some APIs in my environment. Maybe I ask what is the latest threat intelligence indicators for a specific threat actor. Maybe I have an Azure AI search, like a vector database that has some type of security data that I want to relay back. Maybe I'll ask about that, right? So the list goes on here, but it's not limited to that, right? So you'll see down here, you'll have your Shodan, your Netscope, Tanium, etc. Now this is really going to look at event logs, alert, incidents, and policies. Now it's going to determine based on your query, what is your specific need. And then it's going to pull from those specific plugins if there's any related skills. Skills are essentially, think of this as to use, let's say, Defender for Threat Intelligence. There's specific skills that it's going to invoke, and depending on what is invoked is going to be a specific playbook, if you will, to the specific system, if that makes sense. Okay. We'll get more into that so you can kind of see what's going on under the hood. So then we're going to go over here. It's going to modify that prompt, right? And then it's going to touch our model. Notice that this little imaginary line that you see here, I say imaginary, is the trusted boundary. Okay, so this all lives in the Microsoft trusted boundary. This is going to touch the model, specifically Azure OpenAI in the backend. You won't see this as abstracted to you. Then it's going to formulate a response based on that prompt itself. That response is then returned with some grounding post-processing back to the end user. Okay, I've mapped this out here, and this is very similar to the data flows from the architecture itself. I just repurposed the visual diagram in my own format to make it a little bit more straight to the point. It doesn't have all the colors and flair, I know. But notice as well, you'll see here the responsible AI checks are performed on the input prompts and output prompts. So the responsible AI, think of this as the content filtering from Azure OpenAI's service or Azure AI Studio. I have a whole course that covers Azure AI Studio. That's a little out of scope for this perspective, but just so you know, there is responsible AI checks that are ongoing as it's formulating those responses back to the end user, okay? So important to note, right? This is a larger subservice. I'm going to show you what this looks like in the portal, But now let me switch over and I'm going to show you a GitHub repository that kind of helps organizations adopt this service a little bit more with some specific guides in general. So I'm in GitHub. You'll see Azure Copilot for Security. So you have a couple areas, right? Logic apps, monitoring, plugins, and then you have prompt book samples. So we'll start here and just take a quick look. If I go to risky user investigation, just as an example, and it's all in Markdown, nice little logo, right? So required inputs, I need the user UPN and a username, and then description. This is just giving me a description of this, right? Generate a report based on Entra plugin is the user, and then your user UPN. Consider risky. If yes, list the reasons, right? And then determine and list the authentication methods. So this is to help you get the most out of this based on, think of this as a scenario per se. This will tell you the required plugins, right? So Entra, natural language to KQL. This essentially translated so it can be a KQL query to your Defender XDR, and Defender Threat Intelligence, right? I know that is a lot, but just so you're aware of this, right? You can go in here and then start looking at the ways that you can use this, right? Now notice email header analysis and investigation prompt book. Can you triage the email header below and point out what you find suspicious? And then assuming this is your email headers, right, that you're looking for, can you list all the technical indicators of the above prompt? So these are really to kind of get you off the ground, if you will, okay? Now you'll see right here, there's another folder, PowerShell to manage prompt books. So like this method to upload prompt books uses unpublished API calls that are subject to change without notice. So just one of those disclaimers from that perspective, but you can see here, this is a prompt book JSON format. And then this will show you specifically step-by-step what's an access token, and then the prompt book library, what is that actual response back, right, that you can see here. And then execution for download and upload. So this will really give you a good starting point broadly to understand, okay, well, what are the actual ways I can prompt if you're not feeling too hot on, okay, what should I actually use it for? Now, there's other things right here when I talked about those plugins, right? You'll see there is community-based plugins, then Microsoft plugin samples, and then published plugins. So the community-based, think of it as a marketplace from that perspective, right? These are going to be provided by the community for specific plugins that you're trying to look for. So let's say you want to use Copilot logins as an example. How many logins has been for Copilot for security? And then who did it? You'll look here, KQL plugin for Copilot for security logins. So this will show you the specific YAML, right? So you can see here we have a descriptor, display name, format KQL, skills, and identifies Copilot for security logins, right? So target, it's going to use Sentinel from that perspective, your tenant ID, subscription ID, resource group, and your workspace name. And then it's essentially prompting a specific subset, sign-in logs, where time generated 3 days ago, and then it's looking for a specific area. So that's just showing a very simple example, okay? I can go a little bit further, but this is really to help out customers be aware of what they can use and how they can get the most out of it, okay? So wanted to cover that. Now let me switch over to an actual Copilot for security, and I'm just going to quickly show the use of Copilot for security. So let me go to, okay. So just like I spoke about, this will have a session, right? Now I'm going to just show you this before I kind of show you through some settings and whatnot. But I just prompted it saying, what are my recommendations in Defender for Cloud? So I don't have anything related to O365. I'm just a Azure customer from that perspective, right? So I live in the Azure resources, not from a SaaS perspective. So this specifically selected Defender for Threat Intelligence based on your prompt, right? And then this will tell you essentially for transparency how it went through that thought process, if you will, right? So think of this as specific functions that are being called based on your prompt, if you will. And then this is giving me the transparency of, okay, what exactly is it looking for? What is it doing, right? Run safety checks, compose message. And we can see here, based on the recent threat intelligence search, there's no recommendations, right? And then it's just giving me guidance moving forward. Okay, fairly simple. You'll notice down here, if I select prompts, I have prompt books, right, which are guided responses. So a Sentinel incident investigation, suspicious script analysis, and then system capabilities. So you can see here all the capabilities: convert Unix timestamp, analyze security data, etc. These are already out of the box, okay? I haven't done anything. Now when I go into sources, this is where it gets interesting. This is where you have your plugins, and this is what creates that extensibility, if you will. So you have Azure web application firewall, Azure firewall, if I had some of these other ones enabled. I've disabled some because I don't have any use for them, but just so you can see, this is already like out of the box what it comes with. I just set this up literally about an hour ago. And then you can see non-Microsoft, right? So these are all those third parties. Notice there's quite a lot. This will show you specifically what's the setup process, right, for each one. And there's good documentation to help you out. It'll have a nice little logo, and it'll tell you basically how to get that telemetry in there, okay? And then you'll also have this area where it says files. So let's say I have organization knowledge that maybe I want this system to leverage, maybe I have my own incident response plan or some type of response communications mechanism that I wanted to format that will be here. Or that will be the use of how I look at files, or maybe I need to analyze a specific file on something as well. You can use that. Now notice this, it will say 20 out of 20 megabytes remaining. So they have to be kind of small in nature, okay? So when I go to Copilot for Security, this will say Security Copilot.Microsoft, and you'll see here, this will say continue your last session. This is just a nice visual representation. And then this will tell you those prompt books that we saw earlier, just kind of a little bit more front-facing to like a website per se. And I can kind of scroll through the prompt books, and then when you're thinking about sessions, these are all specific little session IDs. So if I go to my sessions here, this will say the session I created, what time I created it, etc. Think about it as an audit log per se. So notice when we think about our usage monitoring, when you're looking at your usage, this will tell you, okay, how much you are using. So I only have one SKU available, and this thing drinks like a tank. It's 3.9 used from that, and now you can see I can dynamically change that based on that usage, okay? But this is to help you identify, okay, well, depending on, let's say I have heavy use, maybe I need to scale up, but you can always scale down, okay? As long as you have one unit provisioned, it's always gonna be available from that perspective. So from a cost savings perspective, this is one of those areas you're probably gonna monitor. So if there's any settings as well that you want to be aware of, when you set up the Copilot for Security, it's going to ask you about if you want to share any of your data to help improve the service. You can opt in, opt out of that. This will show you any type of visual representation, dark, high contrast, and then any of the data privacy, where's the data stored. So when you're creating this, another important note, and I will finish up, is you have the capability to say, okay, if we run out of capacity in the US for a SCU, you can redirect my prompt to the nearest available region based on the usage. You can do that. It's really up to you. Where I'd say to consider things is maybe there is some type of data boundary that you want the data to traverse in, but just to know that that is a capability as well. You'll get prompted on that when you set it up specifically. So hopefully this gave you a good overview. I know I'm trying to break this up in sessions, but ideally the Copilot for Security is a much larger conversation on, okay, how can we actually use AI for security in the best manner, and what are the ways that we can get the most out of it. So I wanted to give you a high level overview, right? What are the uses of it? A, summarization, B, incident response, guided response from that perspective, and then D, collaborating all that telemetry in one specific area for you, using that generative AI to help remediate or help streamline a lot of this. And the examples I use are fairly similar to if you hire a new security analyst, right, and they came from some type of shop, let's say a Google shop from that perspective, and they're not really familiar with Microsoft security stack, and you're trying to get them up to speed on what are prompt books, how do we use Microsoft Sentinel, how do we use Defender for Cloud, XYZ, a number of areas. This service can really help streamline that onboarding process for that analyst to get up and running, but also to help assuage anything that is ongoing for your environment. Ideally, the reason why you'll see the term Copilot being used instead of just pilot from that perspective, it's important to not mix it. It's not going to auto-remediate anything. It's going to have the human in the loop. You're going to go through, for instance, a prompt book, and it's going to synthesize and break down areas that traditionally you might not have on technical staff, right? So maybe an organization has threat hunters, but they don't have reverse engineers for malware analysis, right? This will really help shape a lot of the more modern security operations center. Now, broadly, I think you have to tailor this and get the telemetry out of all those plugins. But once this is configured and you start using it to the fullest extent, I've gone through some very tricky scenarios, and this service really helps streamline a lot of areas that I wouldn't be too familiar in. So that's where I kind of see most of this going. Now, broadly, there is cost, right? So you always want to manage those costs. So when we say to use that monitoring for, okay, what are my usage today? What's my usage for the month? This is going to really dictate kind of your year-over-year expenditures from that perspective. But you also want to think too, monitor the time savings. From that perspective, I'm not saying to let cost cloud judgment as far as time savings is concerned, but that's really a huge proponent of where I see this kind of helping out, is getting you contextual information on what to do, what is going on, and then B, being able to summarize incidents to executive stakeholders, to the organization, instead of spending time crafting up PowerPoints based on step-by-step instructions. This can do a lot of the legwork for most use cases, right? Now, again, these are still, I'd say we're at maybe year 3 since ChatGPT, or 2 years at this point. A lot of these models, right, are incrementally getting better month over month in terms of speed. So it wouldn't surprise me if this response as well that you're seeing will likely be much more quick to give you pinpoint responses as it goes through its life cycle per se. But additionally, if you want to bring in your own data, right, some of those custom API plugins, there's a lot of documentation on the best ways to bring those in. So just things to consider. Hopefully this video helped. I know this is a little bit longer than I typically go. Feel free to drop a comment if this helped in any way, and I'll add some resources to the description. Thank you for your time.